My name is Charlene Margot, and I am the co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are so glad to have all of you with us tonight, and especially glad to have with us author Lisa L. Lewis. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so glad to see such a terrific turnout. It's a topic that I'm passionate about, so I'm really glad to be here tonight. So I am going to share my screen, and let me get that up real quick. Give me 1 second. It's there we go. All right, so there.
Lisa, we're still seeing your screen.
There we go. Do you see now? We should have the title.
That's perfect.
Okay, lovely. So yes, as Charlene mentioned, I will be talking today about why teen and tween sleep matters. And yes, also, as you heard, I was involved in our new law here in California, and I'll talk a little bit more about that during the presentation. But first, I thought I would just tell you quickly a little bit more about my background and how I got involved in this. Because it really stems from my role as a parent. I am a parent. I'm also a parenting journalist. And this issue of school start times and the impact that they have on teen sleep really entered my life in a personal way in 2015, because that was when my oldest, my son, was entering high school. So it was August of 2015 when he was starting his freshman year at our local public high school, which at that point started at 7:30 in the morning, which really was quickly apparent that it was too early. It was the earliest he had ever had to go to school, in all his years. And the high school start time was the earliest of all the times, elementary, middle, and high. And I was the one driving him to school every day. We'd leave the house at 7:10, and it was very obvious that he was not, exactly alert and ready for a full day of learning. So of course, I put on my journalism hat and started trying to figure out, well, why is it that suddenly, there's this huge change in start time, and why is it that our school starts at 7:30? So what I quickly found was several things. The first was that the high schools where I live had started at 7:30 for years and years. This was not a new thing. Nobody, in fact, could really remember a time when it hadn't started so early. The second thing was that this was not just our community that had this issue, that this was really something that was far more widespread around the country, literally, not just here in California. There were other schools starting that early, and some starting even earlier. There were some schools, and there still are in other states, where they have the official start of the day at 7 a.m. And that's for first period, mandatory attendance. That's not zero period. So those are two things I quickly found out. The third was really quite fortuitous, which was at the time that I tapped into this issue, it really was starting to reach a critical mass. Now, I say that because this was 2015. The previous year, 2014, the American Academy of Pediatrics had come out with a very influential policy statement recommending that middle and high schools start no earlier than 8:30 in the morning because of the link between these very early start times and teen sleep and the ramifications that then has. So all of this really had been building over time, but really was starting to hit a critical mass. So I start writing about the issue. My first article started coming out spring of my son's freshman year. But there was one in particular, which was an op-ed that ran in the Los Angeles Times the following September of 2016. And it was called "Why Schools Should Start Later in the Day." So that was, one of these pieces I had written, gathered all the information, you put it out there in the world, you never quite know what the impact will be. Well, in this case, it was read, quite literally read in the newspaper by one of our California state senators, Anthony Portantino, whose district is in Los Angeles. So he read it there, in the print edition of the paper, and it was an issue that resonated with him because, as it so happened, he had a daughter who was just entering high school, and her high school was in the midst of discussions about school start times. So it really struck a chord with him. He decided to look into the issue further with an eye towards introducing a bill on the topic. And that is exactly what ended up happening. And as far as how I then got looped into that, in my information gathering, I had identified all sorts of information sources, including a terrific nonprofit called Start School Later. They've been around since 2011. There are chapters now around the country, but they're a terrific resource on this topic. So I had started my own local chapter of Start School Later with the goal of, making a difference in my community. As it turned out, his office, Anthony Portantino's office, as they were gathering information, also identified Start School Later, who looped in all of us who were chapter leaders in the state. So I, in fact, knew about this bill even before it was introduced. So really from that point on, February of 2017 was when that bill got introduced. It was a 2.5-year journey, learning experience. My first involvement in politics at that level, I found myself testifying up in Sacramento. I was reaching out to education reporters around the country. I was helping with communications. Lengthy process. Vetoed the first time I got to Governor Brown's desk at that point. Went through the whole process again, got to Governor Newsom's desk. He is the one who signed that into law. And that is the law that just went into effect in July. So I can talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on, but I just wanted to sort of set the scene quickly. So I've been immersed in this issue since 2015, 7 years now, and it was as an outgrowth of that whole legislative process that I ended up writing this book. So let's talk a little bit first just about sleep in general. So namely, what happens when we sleep? Because we do spend 1/3 of our lives sleeping. It is not just a matter of shutting down for the night, and the way we shut down our computers. There's actually quite a lot that's going on, and you can see here just sort of some of the quick highlights. So sleep is when we are processing and sorting through all of the information that we have gathered over the course of the day. We are combining that with other bits of knowledge we already had. It's being moved from short-term into long-term storage. I mean, there's quite a lot that's going on in terms of synthesizing all of that information and stimuli that we've gathered. Also, as you can see here, nighttime is a time of healing and growth. That is when the pituitary gland releases growth hormone is while we're sleeping. So that is responsible, as the name implies, for growth, but also for healing from injuries, even recovery from workouts, because those dual processes are essential, and they are happening again while we're sleeping. And finally, as you can see, it is also a time for appetite regulation, because getting enough sleep is what keeps the two hormones in balance. Leptin and ghrelin are the two hormones that influence hunger. So when we have not gotten enough sleep, we are likely to crave higher fat foods. We are also likely to crave more sugary foods. So, and that is something you might find just anecdotally when you haven't got enough sleep. That's why you do find yourself, sort of reaching for those kind of foods that perhaps you might not have otherwise. So quite a lot going on while we're sleeping. But for teens, there is even more going on, because even as all this is going on, teens are in the middle of a major phase of brain development, focused on two main processes. As you can see, they're pruning and remodeling. So we've all heard the term, use it or lose it. And that is literally what's taking place with their brain cells. When the brain is first formed, there is an overabundance of brain cells. And so those do need to get pruned back. And that pruning process happens during adolescence. So in essence, the neurons, the brain cells that are being used the most, develop the strongest connections between them. And those that aren't being used get pruned away. And that's to allow the remaining ones to function more effectively. So when does this take place? While they're sleeping. Now, there's the second phase, which is equally important, which is remodeling. And that has to do with the connectivity between neurons and the speed of processing. So again, this is, there's a lot more I could go into here. I'm just sort of giving the very quick summary. But one of the neuroscientists that I spoke to for this book compared the process to upgrading from a dirt road to a paved freeway. So just to give you a sense of the speed of processing enhancement that goes on. And the end result of all of this brain development is that our teens are able to make better decisions, to focus their attention more effectively, and to behave less impulsively. So, how much sleep does all of this require? Now you can see here, I've got up the chart. These are the recommendations from the National Sleep Foundation, and they were updated in 2015. And in many cases that it broadened the ranges. So you can see for teens, the range up until they hit age 18 is 8 to 10 hours of sleep. And that's broader than what it used to be, which was 8.5 to 9.5 hours. I want to point out 8 hours, as you can see there, is the minimum recommended amount for our teens to be getting. And I think sometimes that comes as somewhat of a surprise to people because we always hear 8 hours, 8 hours being the magical number. Well, 8 hours is, the midpoint for us as adults, but it is the minimum our teens should be getting. And we know that far too many of them are not hitting these recommendations. In fact, it was in 2019, surveyed by the CDC, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, last one that we have this data from, and they found that only 22% of high schoolers were even hitting that minimum of 8 hours a night. So why aren't our teens getting enough sleep? It is because of biology. So during puberty, melatonin, which is the hormone that primes the body to start feeling sleepy, does not get released until later in the evening. It also does not subside until later in the morning. So that whole sleep schedule shifts, and that is that circadian rhythm shift. Now, that explains why our teens are not able to go to sleep as early as they used to. So when you've got a younger child, they wake at the crack of dawn, they're alert, they're ready to go, they play hard, and then they're easy to put to bed, they crash 8 o'clock, whatever time it is. Teens do not crash at 8 o'clock. They're not feeling sleepy until later because of this circadian rhythm shift, later being about 11 o'clock at night. And so then if you just do the math, well, if they're not able to fall asleep until 11, and of course we know not all teens are even getting to bed by 11, and they need 8 to 10 hours, you can see why when schools start too early, it really cuts into that and makes it in some cases virtually impossible for them to be getting the sleep that they need. And there's one other point I wanted to make quickly about that, which is when our teens are forced to wake too early, and again with these early school start times, it cuts into their REM sleep, which is backloaded so that more of it happens during the second half of the night. And that actually is all the sleep stages are important, but the REM sleep is the stage that fuels their creativity. It helps them synthesize information, and it helps regulate their emotions. So cutting into that, generally not a good idea. Now, I have this here because there are a number of misconceptions out there. I mentioned, 8 hours kind of being this mythical number that people tend to think is good for everybody, including teens, when it is not. But these are some of the other things that regularly come up, the kind of questions I get, and the kind of sort of responses when, I would talk to people about the need for later start times because teens need more sleep. So I just want to go through each of these because I think they're very important to address. So the first, that they just need to go to bed earlier, essentially putting it on the teen. Well, if they're so sleepy, they just need to get in bed earlier. So you can make a teen go to bed earlier, but you cannot make them fall asleep. So again, a 6-year-old, sure, they'll fall asleep at 8 o'clock. A teen is not going to unless they are just utterly, utterly exhausted. Again, it's that circadian rhythm shift which governs when they're feeling sleepy. So it really isn't a matter of them just getting to bed earlier. If you put a teen to bed at 9:30, probably they're just going to stare at the ceiling for quite a while. Second one, well, if we move to later start times, the kids are just going to stay up later at night and it's all going to be a wash. And what we have found, research shows that actually is not the case. Yes, teens do tend to stay up slightly later in the evening, but they more than make up for it with the additional sleep that they're able to gain in the morning. So they do, in fact, have a net increase in the amount of sleep that they're able to get when schools shift to later start times. Another one I often hear is, well, it's tech. They just need to get off their phones. That is the issue. So this is also something that has been studied. And the bottom line is that, yes, you can, of course, sabotage your sleep by staying up, till 2 a.m. playing video games. But this issue of teen sleep deprivation predates all of our smartphones and all of our apps. And it is indeed a factor that affects sleep, but it is not the primary driving factor. And then finally, number 4, getting up early is good preparation for the real world. And it surprises me how often I hear this, that, essentially that if they need to learn to get used to it. And, I hesitate to say it's somewhat cruel, but in some ways it does sometimes feel that way, because high school is not meant to be boot camp. And, there's a number of aspects that I think people tend to gloss over when they're sort of focusing on, well, this is good preparation. So the first is, as you saw from that previous slide, teens need more sleep than adults do. So when they are adults in the real world, they will need less sleep. They will need 7 to 9 hours, not 8 to 10 hours, but they are not at that stage right now. So we can't treat them like adults because they are not adults. The other thing is too, when you look at a high school start time of 7 o'clock or 7:30, well, that is not reflective of start times in the world at large. For a teen who is going on to college, it is highly unlikely they are going to have a class every single day of the week that starts that early, or even any days of the week that start that early. And also, once they get out into the work world, there are any number of job schedules out there. There is not one set schedule that every single person follows. Even if they have a desk job, they're not necessarily at their desk at 7 or 7:30 every morning. And the reality is, most of the world, or most people certainly in the US, do not have desk jobs. So there's such a wide array of start times out there. There are people who do shift work and work in restaurants and work overnight shifts. I mean, there is no one schedule that we are trying to get them on. And finally, I just also always like to mention that getting by on less sleep does not build endurance. There's nothing positive that comes from being sleep deprived. They're not benefiting in any way. In fact, it's actually the opposite, because when they're sleep deprived, it drags down their mental health, their driving ability, their sports ability, and their academic performance. So let's look at some of these aspects. So I'd like to start with mental health, because I think it is such an important and crucial topic for us to be focused on, especially in light of everything that's gone on these last few years. Now you can see here, so when teens don't get enough sleep, their emotions run hotter. So it's not just teens, we are all more reactive and impulsive when we haven't gotten enough sleep. I know for myself, I'm definitely more crabby if I haven't gotten a good night's sleep. But there's a key difference between me and any other adult and a teen, which is that teen brains are less well equipped to be able to deal with sleep loss. So I didn't have time to get into all of the brain development that goes on, but part of it is, in addition to the connectivity and the remodeling that's taking place between neurons and brain cells, it's also in different regions of the brain and the connectivity. And that all happens sort of in a wave, moving from back to front. The last section that to mature, if you will, is the prefrontal cortex. So teens don't yet have a mature prefrontal cortex, which is what helps with impulse control and other executive functioning skills. So when they are sleep deprived, they don't have that same buffer that we do. Second point there, that inadequate sleep is linked with depression. And this has been borne out by numerous studies that show that teens who don't get enough sleep are more likely to report feeling depressed. And even if they don't have actual depression, there's another condition known as anhedonia, which has to do with their ability just to experience joy. That's muted when you're sleep deprived. So just being able to notice and appreciate the little things in your day, that is much harder when you're sleep deprived. So, that's a quality of life aspect when you're just sort of trudging through your days and not able to even find these little moments. And then finally, and most concerning, as teen sleep duration goes down, their suicide risk goes up. So the highest risk of suicide is during the preteen to young adulthood years. So when I was writing my book, I looked at the CDC data for 2019 and several years prior. And in all those years, suicide was the second leading cause of death for preteens, teens, and young adults in the United States. And as I show there, as teen sleep duration goes down, their suicide risk goes up. Just in a data point, a study in Fairfax County, Virginia, found that each hour of lost sleep was linked to a 42% increase in suicidal thoughts and a 58% increase in suicide attempts. Now, one final piece is that sleepier teens also make riskier choices, and that gets back to the impulsive behavior. But that when you combine that with increased impulsivity, that penchant to make riskier choices when they're sleep deprived really can have tragic consequences, which I think we do need to acknowledge, especially when we're talking about suicidality. Now, I'm not going to be able tonight to get into all of the different ramifications of being sleep deprived, but I do want to highlight several of the major ones, including sports. So as you can see here, better sleep leads to better performance. Sleep is a competitive advantage. So there was a very influential study done at Stanford, in fact, in 2011 by Dr. Sherry Ma. She then moved to UCSF. I think she's now back at Stanford, and she's one of the experts that I interviewed for the book. So she worked with the Stanford men's basketball team to try to get them to increase their sleep and to see what the results were. So the goal was to have them stay in bed at least 10 hours a night as a way to hopefully get them to increase their sleep time, which indeed happened. They had been averaging less than 7 hours of sleep before this study. And as a result, they were able to increase that time to about 8.5 hours. So pretty huge increase from less than 7 hours of sleep a night to about 8.5 hours a night. And it had some pretty dramatic results, as you can see there. They ended up having a 9% increase in successful free throws, 9% increase in three-point field goals, and faster sprint times. So this whole idea of sleep as a competitive advantage is really something that has now spread fairly widely among not just collegiate athletes, professional teams also. Many of them do have a sleep consultant or sleep coach work with their players because sleep is a competitive advantage. And it is, of course, essential for our teen athletes too. It enhances performance. It affects everything from reaction times to coordination. It's also a protective factor against injuries. And as I'd mentioned in one of the earlier slides, when we sleep is when growth hormone is released, and that is what helps us heal from injuries. So sleep too is important for athletes who are recovering from an injury. Now, another aspect I'd like to talk about is school performance. So I'm laughing a bit because there are any number of pictures I could have put up here. Every single article I've ever seen on school start times has a picture like this of some kid fast asleep on their desk. So obviously a kid who is literally asleep is not learning. But even when they are awake, if they are sleep deprived, it affects learning. And it affects it actually in three key ways. The first is acquiring information. So when they're in the classroom, they are first learning that information to have it actually get absorbed and not just sort of, go over them. If their eyes are open and they're just kind of glazed, obviously they're not really acquiring that information in the first place. Second is retaining the information. That gets back to all of these processes that happen when we're asleep, synthesizing information and storing it, et cetera. That is impeded if they're not getting enough sleep. And then the third is the ability to retrieve the information. So when they are trying to remember what they learned in class so they can do their homework or build on concepts or remember it for their tests, that's a whole lot harder if you haven't gotten enough sleep. And there are a number of other ways that sleep deprivation affects schools as well. So as I mentioned earlier, school start times have an established link to teens' ability to get enough sleep. And when schools have moved to later start times, they have found that absences go down, tardies go down, attendance goes up, grades go up, and graduation rates go up too. So while I was in the midst of this whole process, helping get our new law in place in California, very impressive study came out. I think this was probably 2017, in fact, and the researcher looked at data from, it covered 30,000 high schoolers in 29 high schools in 7 states that had changed to later start times at various points in time. So there was no one sort of external factor, that you could point to. But what she found is 2 hours after this change, the average graduation rate rose from 79% to 88%. That's huge. And this was something, again, that was seen regardless of when they had made this shift or where this had taken place. Now, I do want to touch on this. This is a huge topic here. So I feel like I'm not doing it justice, but I think it is still so essential just to raise this, because not all teens sleep the same. I have a whole chapter on this in my book, and even that is a summary of some very complex topics, which are all the subject of ongoing research. But I do want to just hit on these quickly because they are so important and they do affect sleep. So first, looking at biological sex. Biological females, and I'm just going to shorthand say girls, but really what I mean is biological females, because this is biologically based. Up until puberty, girls and boys really don't show much difference in sleep, but it does start to sort of split at puberty, at which point girls start to take longer to fall asleep and also become more prone and have a higher risk of insomnia. So the unfortunate reality is girls and women do have a higher risk of insomnia, do take longer to fall asleep. And we know too that girls and women, biological females, sleep can be and often is affected by their menstrual cycle. I mean, these are powerful hormones that, when you have menstrual pain, when you have PMS, it is very likely that it can be affecting your sleep. And there are a number of degrees of pain, certainly, but up to 93% of teen girls say that they get cramps when they get their periods. And just to set a little bit more context of how widespread this is, in the US, about half of US girls have gotten their periods by age 12. So, this is a regular occurrence, and this is something that absolutely has the potential and unfortunately does often affect sleep. And this is above and beyond everything else that's going on. Same when we talk about sexual and gender minority teens. So studies show that LGBTQ teens and adults do sleep worse than their counterparts. And this is really significant, particularly when we are talking about teens and tweens. A Gallup poll that was released earlier this year showed that more than 20% of the Gen Z respondents to their most recent survey said that they identify as LGBTQ. So this really is a large and growing segment of the younger portion of the population. Now, as far as why they tend to sleep worse, unfortunately, a lot of this is due to discrimination. And there are certain subgroups also that tend to experience sleep issues at an even higher degree. And again, there's so much here, so I fear that I'm sort of giving it short shrift, but I just wanted I just wanted to mention it so that we could at least be aware of all these factors. Same for race and ethnicity. We know that teens of color are disproportionately likely to sleep poorly. Many of these differences are rooted in discrimination. There are also epigenetic factors, essentially sort of the longer term consequences of stress and discrimination that get handed down generationally. And just sort of the up that our teens may be facing during the course of the day, those all take a cumulative toll. And finally, socioeconomic status, just to mention, the effects of things like poverty and neighborhoods are very real in terms of how they can affect sleep. If you live somewhere where it's noisy, or you're in a crowded situation, or you don't feel safe, it's going to make it harder for you to get a good night's sleep. Same if you go to bed hungry. So these are all factors that are often above and beyond what our teens are already facing. And then, of course, a teen may have more than one of these categories, may fit into more than one of these categories, and may have these multiple additional complicating factors when it comes to getting a good night's sleep. So what I'd like to do now is shift and talk a little bit about how we can help our teens get more sleep. So you can see here, school bus. So what I'd like to do is talk just very quickly about the background on school start times. As I mentioned, our school was starting at 7:30. Often, far too often that's been the case around the country. It was not always that way. Schools used to start closer to 9 o'clock in the morning, but they gradually drifted earlier over time. And that was due to a confluence of factors that included suburbanization, the consolidation to larger high schools. So then, schools started implementing these bus routes. Well, and then they started trying to control costs. And one way of doing that was paring down the number of buses being used by implementing a tiered system. So just using one fleet of buses to do the drop-offs and the pickups at elementary, middle, and high schools. At the time that they were doing this, though, and setting these schedules in place, the research into teen sleep and differences that the circadian rhythm shift that adolescents undergo was not yet widely known. So often by default, the teens, the high schoolers, were put into that earliest slot with, the assumption being, oh, well, they're older, they should be best able to handle it. Well, now, of course, we know that is not the case. If anything, it should be flipped, but those legacy schedules have endured. So when it comes to school start times, we now know that when schools start later, teens get more sleep. This has been studied since the very first schools changed their start times based on the research, which was back in the 1990s. The very first school to do this was in Edina, Minnesota in 1996. So there is quite a large body of research on this. This is not at all experimental. So just a couple quick data points in terms of some of the results. Prior to California implementing this, because we are the first and only state to have done so, some of the largest areas included the city of Seattle, which did so in 2016. And they did a pre and post survey to look at the impact on teen sleep. And what they found was that when they moved their start times from 7:50 to 8:45, there was a 34-minute increase in median sleep duration. So now that obviously gives you a sense of the kind of gains. Even more impressive, though, was Cherry Creek, which is a suburb of Denver. And it's actually a pretty large district. They've got about 55,000 kids. So they made this change in 2017. They moved their high school start time from 7:10 to 8:20. And what they found was that after 2 years, students were getting about 45 to 50 minutes more sleep. So examples like those have continued to accrue over the years. And as I mentioned, the policy statement from the AAP that came out in 2014 was hugely influential. So when they made this recommendation, they did so because of all the critical ways that sleep is important for teen health and well-being, and based on this long track record. So that really was a turning point. After that, the American Medical Association issued a similar statement, the American Psychological Association, American Academy of Sleep Medicine. I mean, at this point, pretty much every major medical and public health group out there has concurred with this. So all of this is what helped pave the way for California's new law. So as I mentioned, the law went into effect on July 1st of this year. So this is the first school year that it has been in effect. And it affects all public, including charter, high schools and middle schools in the state. So the start time for high schools, 8:30 or later, and for middle schools, 8 o'clock or later. Now you can see there, 8 o'clock is not 8:30. And that was a change that was made during the whole political process. It was a way to provide additional flexibility. In some cases, there were requests for that because that was a way to help handle transportation issues. So that is why that is 8 o'clock or later. But again, the hope is that the or later piece is very key because the ideal state is still 8:30 or later. Nevertheless, we are still the first and only state to set any sort of a limit for how early is too early for schools to start. So this in and of itself is a huge accomplishment. A couple other key points I wanted to mention. I think I mentioned earlier, zero periods are not covered by the law. So this refers to the official start of the school day when kids are required to be there. Optional zero periods still allowed. And the second piece was that there was a 3-year implementation window for this. So it was signed into law in the fall of 2019, did not go into effect until this year to allow communities enough time to prepare. Now, regardless of location, regardless of where a shift to later start times has taken place, because it's happened in communities as small as one single high school, in counties like Fairfax County, Virginia, in cities like Seattle, and now in the state of California. But the same basic issues tend to come up. So I'd like to just go through these very quickly, and there's so much more we could say, but just to kind of to give the highlights. So the first overall is a resistance to change. I mean, change itself can be inconvenient. And when it comes to start times, as parents, we have constructed our lives around school start times and end times. Most of the time we've had to continue to adjust as our kids move up through the system. If you're in a public high school district, very often elementary schools have one set time, middle schools have another, high schools have another. So we've had to adjust as our kids have gone up through the system. And we've had to come up with some sort of a wraparound solution when our kids get out at 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I still remember my kids' elementary school ended at 1:52, and I had to be there every day, or I had to have arranged care for them. So these schedules already are not convenient, and yet we've had to sort of carefully cobble together this way to build our lives around them. So when you hear about a change, the knee-jerk reaction is often just, oh no, not another change, because of everything we've had to go through already. Now, another issue that often comes up, transportation. So I will just mention here, there are a variety of ways kids get to school, especially by the time they hit high school. There are concerns about drowsy driving, especially for teen drivers. Concerns too about walking or riding a bike to school when it's still dark. When it comes to districts that have this sort of a tiered schedule where they had put the high schools in the earliest slot and just had left it that way for years and years, they can often literally do a flip so that the elementary schools start earlier, then the middle schools, then the high schools. Larger districts can often use modeling software to come up with alternate ways to rejigger their transportation. Oftentimes that hasn't been done in quite some time. And then finally, just to recognize, teens are far better able to get themselves ready and get themselves out the door, and in some cases literally get themselves to school by driving, than younger kids. So having high schools start later, doesn't require that same level of parental involvement that it does with, say, a 6-year-old. Sports, another big one. And I will just point out that's the beauty of a statewide change, is that schools don't have to negotiate with other schools about shifting their times, which up until now, any other city or district that has changed their times has usually had to do. And that's a discussion that takes place, and they come up with a way to work through it, and it works. But it is indeed a piece that has sort of been taken off the table here in California. Couple other things I already mentioned. Obviously, for athletes, being well rested improves their performance, reduces their likelihood of injury. So that's actually a good thing when it comes to sports. And there's one other piece, which I just glossed over quickly on the school performance side, which is that getting enough sleep also impacts grades. So when you play sports, you have to hit the minimum eligibility, which in California means maintaining a 2.0. And what that means is that before a game, say on Friday before a football game, the coach has to ensure that every kid has hit that for that week, because if they haven't and they play that kid, they've got to forfeit that game. So that can actually be something that is hugely important for athletes who may be struggling with their grades. And then the final piece, work schedules, family issues. As I mentioned, the current schedules are not particularly family friendly. There are very few people whose jobs get out early afternoon, who get off summers, who get off a week at Thanksgiving and 2 or 3 weeks at Christmas and a week for spring break and random days off during the year that happen to exactly coincide with teacher prep days. I mean, inherently, this is not family friendly to begin with. And I think we just need to acknowledge that. But when we make a shift, it does have these sort of ripple effects. And it's so important to acknowledge that and to address them. And that gets back to the need for, in California, this 3-year implementation period to be able to give people enough notice so that they can adjust. Just to mention, though, too, as I had mentioned earlier about sort of, this sense that, oh, well, everyone's going off to an office job, and so therefore this isn't convenient. That's not really the case. In the US, after the federal government, the two largest private employers in the United States are Amazon and Walmart. Now, there are people who work in headquarters for both of those companies, of course, who do work at desk jobs, but by and large, those are not office jobs. Those are people working in warehouses or retail, working overnight shifts. So, I mean, just to acknowledge the wide variety of work schedules out there. Then finally, just to mention quickly, there was a study done in 2019 by 2 economists at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what they found was that students at later starting schools were just as likely to have after-school jobs as those at earlier starting schools, because that's something else that comes up. So addressing all these issues is why it is so important to allow enough time after making the decision to make the shift and having it actually go into effect, because these are all real issues and they do indeed need to be addressed, but they can and have countless times been successfully addressed. Now, we know that having later start times is the single biggest policy change that has been shown to help teens get more sleep. But there are also other actions that we can take in our homes and at school. So I would like to just talk super quickly about those. I do want to be sure to leave enough time for questions. First one, is your teen on overload? So, in addition to this, and you see this sort of list here of some of the sample things that they've got going on in the course of a given day. But the reality is, in addition to class time and homework, our teens have so much else going on. They've got, many of them, they do have the homework, which of course, if they're taking advanced or honors level classes, can be even greater. They may be involved in sports, including club sports or other extracurriculars, speech and debate, drama, band, what have you, jobs. So it is often easy to sort of underestimate the cumulative impact of all of those activities in terms of how much time they take. So in my book, Challenge Success, which is a group that many of you may be familiar with, allowed me to include their worksheet and their planning sheet for this in the appendix. And it's basically a sheet, and you can also just do this on a piece of paper, where you write down all of these time commitments. So the amount of time that they spend in school, the amount of time for each class for homework, the amount of time for all those extracurriculars for their job, and just add all that up and see, is there even an 8 to 10 hour window left to give our teens the opportunity to get enough sleep? Because if there's not, it may be time for a reality check. And then finally, tech use. Again, huge topic. I have a whole chapter about this in the book, but I did want to just touch super quickly on this because it's so important. There are 3 ways that tech use can impact sleep. So the first is the time that we spend online, because that is quite literally, taking time away that they could be sleeping if they are doing this late at night. The content itself is stimulating and engaging. And so that's helping them feel more alert, which is obviously the opposite of what you want when you're trying to get ready to drift off to sleep. And then the third way is the impact of blue light. And I just wanted to point out, because it was surprising to me when I dug into the research and talked to the experts, that the impact of blue light was actually the third of those 3 ways that tech use affects sleep. So it is important. The blue light that often these backlit devices emit can impact the timing for the release of melatonin. But again, those other 2 ways, the fact that what they're doing is cutting into their time and that it's stimulating and engaging, are actually probably the 2 more important ways that tech use affects sleep. Tech is ingrained, it's immersive, it's been designed to be immersive. I mean, there's so much I could say about that, but it plays into our teens' reward-seeking behaviors, which they are uniquely primed for as teens. Social media, likes, that's exactly what that is. Leveling up in a game, that's what it is. And everything has been designed to keep us sucked in as long as possible. Watching a TV show, binge watching, you finish an episode and it just seamlessly goes right into the next episode. I'm guilty of spending too much time, and our teens are too. So best practices. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no tech devices an hour before bedtime. At a minimum, if they are going to have their devices in their room, have them turn off notifications, ideally charge all devices in a central location that's not the bedrooms, and be a role model. I think it's so important for us to be walking the talk and just to make sleep a priority, because when we are well rested as parents and our teens are well rested, it really sets the stage for better interactions. So with that, I am ready to answer some questions.
Wow, thank you, Lisa. That was a lot. That was a lot. And we have a lot of wonderful questions from you, the audience. So let's just go to it, Lisa, and see how we do.
Wonderful. Yes, there's so much to say about sleep.
I know, and we want to hear it. So the number 1 overriding question is, how in the heck do you get your teens to go to bed earlier? What kind of strategies can you do for kids who are resistant to going to bed on time?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. How to get our teens on board, in other words. Yeah. So I think in many cases, our teens will know that they are sleep deprived. They know when they're feeling sleepy. I will say, when they are sleep deprived, is probably not the best time to have the conversation. Probably isn't gonna go quite as positively. When it comes to things like tech use, getting them on board can be a process. This is where the recommendation would be set house rules, like the ones I was just mentioning, charging devices in a central location, but set them when the kids are young. It can still be done when they're older. If you are doing this for the first time with a teen, it's probably going to be a lengthier process. You do want their buy-in. You don't want to just be issuing edicts, because generally speaking, that doesn't work very well. Getting their buy-in, or even, encouraging them, turn off the notifications, try putting your phone elsewhere, and then see how that works. So sort of getting it to be something where they are seeing it for themselves. And also, I think this gets back to just making sleep a priority in our home. So talking about, how much sleep they should be getting, how much sleep we as adults should be getting, letting them see us practicing good habits. All of that will go a long way towards helping.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And audience, we wish we had more time for each of these topics. In terms, for example, of technology, on Friday, we have the authors coming of a new book, Behind Their Screens, What Teens Are Facing and Adults Are Missing. So join us on Friday. Lisa has tried tonight to give us a real broad summary of all the issues, but her book goes into each of these areas in detail. So here's some good, really kind of straightforward questions. Lisa, here's one I like. What if the teen is getting 8 hours, but in chunks? That means not 8 hours straight in one sleep. My son likes to take naps after school or after dinner.
Yeah, so naps are essentially a compensatory strategy when you're not getting enough sleep at night. So ideally, you want to be getting, the 8 to 10 hours at night. The reality is, for some of us, even for adults, a power nap can be lovely. A nap in the afternoon is far better than a nap after dinner, simply because that's much closer to bedtime. And so the risk you run is that then it sort of just perpetuates the cycle. Because if you nap too late in the day, and if you nap too long, and too long being really longer than about 45 minutes, you really do run the risk of making it that much harder to feel sleepy at a reasonable hour, and then it just keeps going.
All right, so here's one. For the new California start time law, was 8:30 selected as the earliest start time? If the US switches to daylight savings time, actually no daylight savings time, will we see a loss of some of the benefits of the law?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the issue would be if we went to daylight savings year round. And there was that, that had been proposed at the federal level. Thank goodness it appears to not have gone anywhere. It's a pain when we have this shift twice a year. And so this always comes up, predictably that was introduced right after we sprung forward. The danger would be in terms of the impact on sleep if we were to go to daylight savings year round. So if anything, we should go back to standard time year round. I think that there really isn't an impact in terms of what we have right now, other than there is an impact in spring when that happens, because the adjustment, there usually car crashes go up that week. People tend to grumble about it because they're tired. But as far as the long-term impact, that would happen if we went to daylight savings time year round.
Okay, and there's also some request here, Lisa, maybe there's some of this in your book. Are there any TikTok videos or any resources to help parents convince their kids to go to bed earlier and that they need that 8 to 10 hours of sleep you suggest?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, well, some of it, I think you can sort of tailor the information when you're talking to your kid. If you have an athlete talking about the fact that sleep is a competitive advantage, talking about the fact that, Andre Iguodala is a huge believer in sleep. I've got some information about him in my book, and he used to be one of those people who stayed up late playing video games and then would take a 3-hour nap. And he found, lo and behold, when he stopped doing that, even an amazing athlete like him saw tremendous gains in terms of performance. So keying into what is important to your kid, I think, can help. There is also one resource I will mention, which is letssleep.org. And they do have various, videos and some more kind of teen-friendly, like interactive type activities to talk about some of this. But I think in some cases it's sort of making this, again, part of the conversation we have in our homes, and making sure that they understand that sleep is a priority, and sort of figuring out the pieces that are important to them and kind of focusing on those. I don't know that there's a specific video that's going to do the trick, unfortunately.
I remember our pediatrician telling my son that, you grow when you're sleeping. So that is a compelling argument for many kids.
Absolutely, yes. See, and you figure out what is it that's going to speak to them, based on what they find important, and just sort of, lean a little more heavily on those messages.
Yeah, so we have just a few minutes. I'm gonna just comment on this and then give you time for some final words. Lisa, parent notes, I find that sleep deprivation creates a vicious cycle. The more tired we are, the harder it is to go to bed early enough to get enough sleep. Everything takes longer. There's more anxiety. It's depressing to go to bed so late, but what can be done about that? I mean, again, I agree. It is a vicious cycle. What would you say to that?
Yeah, no, it's hard. I mean, and we face this too as adults. Adults are sleep deprived, unfortunately. That
Yeah.
tends to be the reality. For teens, what we can do is, advocating for later start times, which we now have in California. So that helps because it helps them not have to wake too early. But for teens who are still going to bed late, looking at what are some of the other causes, I guess, that are cutting into their sleep. Because you're right, when you are overtired, everything takes longer. Like studying, you can sit there and study the same page in a book, for 15 minutes and nothing is being absorbed. So it certainly isn't, an effective way for them to be spending their time. And it may mean things like looking at whether they're overscheduled. That is a very real piece. And that's a larger issue because that can be the peer pressure they're feeling. It can come from school, it can come from families. They may feel they have to take 18 electives. Obviously I'm exaggerating, but there's a point when it's too much. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And then the other piece too is helping them, for instance, I go into this more in my book, things like helping them establish a wind down routine. So something to help ease that process for going to sleep, because you can't just study, or, be on with your phone, with your friends, and then just expect to turn it off and go right to sleep. So helping them come up with a routine, like the same series of steps that they do, and things like dimming the lights. I mean, there are a lot of things we can do in our homes that can help them too, so that hopefully when they're ready to go to bed, they've sort of helped themselves transition more into that mode.
Absolutely. I like that you use that phrase, come up with together, Lisa, because I think this is a collaborative thing that parents and especially teenagers can do together. As you say, the kids know when they're tired and they would like to get more sleep. So again, I thank everybody who's been with us tonight. We tried to cover a lot of information. I highly recommend Lisa Lewis's book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen. She does go into much more detail on all the topics we touched on tonight. I thank all of you who stuck with us because this is such a big topic. All of your questions really were wonderful. Wish we could have gotten to everyone. So Lisa, I would like to give you then the final floor. Any parting comments for us tonight?
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for all the questions. I am happy to talk offline. My website is there, and my emails through there. I'm happy to respond. I do go into a lot of this in my book, but I just want to, I think the final message really is to reiterate what I've said about helping make sleep a priority for ourselves as well as our teens, and just recognizing how much pressure they're under. I mean, just being a teen is stressful. There's so much that they have going on. There's all the demands, all the expectations, the stressors of the last few years. Their sleep often is getting squeezed by all of this. And there's so much that's out of our control, but this is a tangible step we can take to help our teens.
Thank you, Lisa. That is really well said. So parents, caregivers, all of you who help care for our children, thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight, and special thanks to Lisa L. Lewis and this wonderful talk on our sleep-deprived teens. Thank you, everybody. Good night. We hope to see you again soon.